Good morning and welcome to the Justice Committee's 10th meeting of 2020. We have no apologies. Agenda item 1 is whether to take item 8 on our work programme in private. Are we all agreed? Yes. Thank you. Agenda item 2 is consideration of 2 affirmative instruments. The Scottish Courts and Tribunal Service Judicial Members Amendment Order 2020 draft and the Scottish Courts and Tribunal Service Procedure for Appointment of Members Amendment Regulations 2020 draft. And I welcome Ash Denham, Minister for Community Safety, and her officials, Walter Drummond-Murray, Head of Reserve Tribunals and Civil Courts team, and Martin Brown, Legal Directorate with the Scottish Government. I refer members to paper 1, which is a note by the clerk, and invite the Minister to make a short opening statement.
Good morning to the committee and good morning, convener. So this amendment order is made in exercise of the powers conferred by paragraph 2.5 of Schedule 3 of the Judiciary and Courts Scotland Act of 2008. And this is the first of 2 amendments which I will bring before you today. And together they allow the appointment of summary sheriffs to the board of the Scottish Courts and Tribunal Service. This order amends paragraph 2.2e of Schedule 3 of the Judiciary and Courts Scotland Act 2008 to broaden the existing category of membership from those holding the office of sheriff to those holding either the office of sheriff or of summary sheriff. And the office of summary sheriff was, of course, established by the Courts Reform Act of 2014, and summary sheriffs are now a well-established part of the judicial landscape in Scotland. And the Act of 2008 currently makes no provision for those holding the office of summary sheriff to be appointed to the board of the Scottish Courts and Tribunal Service. And so the Lord President has requested that this anomaly be rectified. The board has 14 members in total, 8 of whom hold judicial office, and currently the categories of judicial office listed in Schedule 3 allow for 2 persons holding the office of sheriff to be appointed to the board. So by broadening the existing category of sheriff to include that of summary sheriff, neither the overall numbers of persons on the board nor the judicial majority is altered in any way. So it's in order to ensure that summary sheriffs are able to apply for membership of the board, a further amendment is required to Regulation 2.3a of the 2015 Board Appointment Regulations, which detail the process to be followed when filling vacancies, as this regulation currently refers again only to sheriffs. So the board of SCTS is led by the Lord President and has collective responsibility for setting the strategic direction and ensuring its good governance. And one of the policy intentions of the 2008 Act is to ensure that the board has a judicial majority in its membership, and this includes representation from each level of the judiciary. So this amendment order, in conjunction with the consequential amendment to the appointment procedure regulations, will fulfil that policy intention. Convener, is it agreeable if I then move on to the regulations?
Yes, please.
So these are made in exercise of the powers conferred by paragraph 3, 2 and 3 of Schedule 3 to the Judiciary and Courts Scotland Act, again of 2008. And these regulations amend the Scottish Courts and Tribunal Service Procedure for Appointment of Members Regulations of 2015, which set out the procedure for the selection and nomination for appointment of members of SCTS. Specifically, the amendment provides that summary sheriffs are to be notified of relevant vacancies for members of the board. And these regulations, in conjunction with the amendment order, fulfil that policy intention, allowing summary sheriffs to be appointed to the board of SCTS.
Do members have any questions or comments on either or both of these instruments? Nothing? Okay. With that then, agenda item 3 is formal consideration of the motions in relation to the 2 affirmative instruments. The Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee has considered and reported on the instruments and has no comments. The motion will be moved with an opportunity for formal debate if necessary. The motion is motion S5M-21023 that the Justice Committee recommends that the Scottish Courts and Tribunal Service Judicial Members Amendment Order 2020 draft be approved. Minister to move.
Formally moved.
Okay. The question is that motion 21023 in the name of Ashdown be approved. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Thank you. The second motion is motion S5M-21024, that the Justice Committee recommends that the Scottish Courts and Tribunals Service procedure for appointment of members, Amendment Regulations 220 draft, be approved. Minister to move.
Moved.
Do members have any comments or questions? No. The question is that motion 21024 in the name of Ashdown be approved. Are we all agreed? Agreed. Thank you. We're going to suspend briefly now for a change of government officials. Agenda item 4 is consideration of 4 affirmative instruments. The first tribunal for Scotland, transfer of functions of bus lane adjudicators, regulations 2020 draft. The first tier tribunal for Scotland, transfer of functions of parking adjudicators, regulations 2020 draft. And the first tier tribunal for Scotland, general regulatory chamber parking and bus lane cases, and upper tribunal for Scotland, composition regulations 2020 draft. And the first tier tribunal for Scotland, general regulatory chamber parking and bus lane appeals, rules of procedure regulations 2020 draft. The Minister for Community Safety is already with us, so I welcome her other officials, Paula Stevenson, Head of Devolved Tribunals, and Joanne Tinto, Legal Directorate with the Scottish Government. I refer members to paper 2, which is a note by the Clerk, and invite the Minister to make a short opening statement.
Thank you, Convener. So this suite of 4 fairly technical regulations will transfer the parking and bus lane adjudicators into the Scottish Tribunals structure created by the Tribunals Scotland Act 2014. And for brevity, I'll refer to this now as the PBLA. The first 2 instruments before you are the first tier Tribunal for Scotland, transfer of functions of parking adjudicators regulations 2020, and the first tier Tribunal for Scotland, transfer of functions of bus lane adjudicators regulations 2020. These regulations simply transfer the functions and members of the PBLA to the first tier Tribunal for Scotland. And in addition, the regulations set out the transitional procedure for cases that are in progress on the date of transfer. The regulations also make consequential amendments to primary and secondary legislation resulting from the transfer of the PBLA into the Scottish Tribunals. As the parking adjudicators and bus lane adjudicators are listed separately in the Tribunals Act, each need to be dealt with in separate instruments. And the third of these regulations is the first tier Tribunal for Scotland, general regulatory chamber parking and bus lane cases, and upper Tribunal for Scotland, composition regulations 2020. These regulations specify the type of member who will hear parking and bus lane cases. The provisions for the first tier tribunal mirror the existing composition of the PBLA. The instrument also sets out the composition of the upper tribunal when hearing appeals from parking and bus lane cases heard in the first tier tribunal. And the regulations allow for the sheriff to hear an appeal in the upper tribunal, and the president of tribunals will determine who will hear these appeals. The final set of regulations is the first tier Tribunal for Scotland, general regulatory chamber parking and bus lane appeals, rules of procedure regulations 2020, and the 2014 Act authorises rules to be made to regulate the practice and procedure of both the first tier and the upper tribunals. paragraph 4.2 of Schedule 9 to the 2014 Act requires rules to be made by Scottish ministers until such time as responsibility for rulemaking passes to the Scottish Civil Justice Council and the Court of Session. And these regulations establish rules of procedure for the first-tier tribunals, General Regulatory Chamber, when hearing parking cases and bus lane cases. The rules of procedure, insofar as possible, have been drawn from the existing rules of procedure for appeals heard by parking adjudicators and from the existing rules of procedure for appeals heard by the bus lane adjudicators. And there are a number of areas in which the new rules of procedure differ from the existing parking adjudicator and bus lane adjudicator rules. And the policy intent in doing so was to bring the various rules together into one document, which would apply to both parking and bus lane cases. And this is intended to aid consistency within Scottish tribunals. And the main change from the existing rules lies in the new draft 18, which makes provision for consideration of an application for permission to appeal to the upper tribunal. So under the current system, no onward right of appeal from the decisions of parking adjudicators and bus lane adjudicators exists. So upon transfer, the provisions of the 2014 Act will apply and the upper tribunal will be available. Other substantive changes from the existing rules involve incorporation throughout the rules of the use of online case management system as a means of communication between the parties and the first-tier tribunal. In addition, specific provision is made for the signing of documents electronically. It is the case that each of these four instruments plays a part in enabling the transfer of the PBLA to the new structure. And I understand that the DPLRC considered these regulations in February and that they had no points to raise.
Do members have any comments or question on any of the instruments? Liam Kerr?
Yes, thank you. All seems terribly sensible. Just a couple of clarifications, if you would, please, Minister. Looking at the adjudicators, so the actual people, the adjudicators are going to transfer somewhere. And according to this policy note that we've got, they will transfer to the first-tier tribunal to become legal members as long as they meet the relevant eligibility criteria set out in Regulations 2015-381. So presumably there is the possibility that some existing adjudicators may not transfer then, if they don't meet whatever the new eligibility criteria are. Is that the case?
So there's only two, and they both meet the eligibility criteria. And just for your reassurance, there are no plans to replace that eligibility criteria for any members, and that's why there's no specific eligibility criteria regulations that are being laid as part of this transfer process.
I see. Thank you. And then the only other thing, so there's been a business and regulatory impact assessment for all of this, and it says the impact will be minimal. The one thing that I just wanted to clear up, because there's a new right of appeal to the upper tribunal in the General Regulatory Chamber Parking and Bus Lane cases. So there's an upper tribunal which will hear appeals. One would have thought that if there is a new right of appeal, that could have a significant cost and resource implication. Is that the case? And if so, has that been taken into account then in the regulatory impact assessment?
It has, that's correct. So you're quite right to point that out, that local authorities already undertake this duty and they have to fund the system. But as the system is bringing in the new possibility of referral upwards to a higher level, at the moment, that will not be expected to be covered by local authorities, and so there may be a very small, we anticipate it to be a very, very small number of cases, and at the moment that will be taken forward, the costs associated with that will be covered by the Scottish Government until such time as we are able to update the legislation.
Hence why you conclude the impact is minimal. So that makes sense. Thank you.
Okay. Are there any more questions or comments? In that case, Agenda 5 is formal consideration of the motions in relation to the 4 affirmative instruments. As the Minister confirmed, the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee has considered and reported on these instruments and has no comments. The motion will be moved with an opportunity for formal debate if necessary, and the motion is S5M-2 21025 that the Justice Committee recommends that the First Tier Tribunal for Scotland transfer of functions of bus lane adjudicators Regulations 2020 draft be approved. Minister to move.
Moved.
Do members have any comments, questions? No. The question is that motion 21025 in the name of Ashdenham be approved. Are we all agreed? Agreed. The second motion is motion S5M-21026 that the Justice Committee recommends that the First Tier Tribunal for Scotland transfer of functions of parking adjudicators Regulations 2020 draft be approved. Minister to move.
Moved.
Moved. Do members have any questions or comments? No. The question is that motion 21026 in the name of Ashdenham be approved. Are we all agreed? Agreed. The third motion is motion S5M-21027 that Justice Committee recommends that the First Tier Tribunal for Scotland General Regulatory Chamber Parking and Bus Lane cases and Upper Tribunal for Scotland Composition Regulations 2020 draft be approved. Minister to move.
Moved.
Do members have any questions or comments? No. Then the question is that motion 21027 in the name of Ashdenham be approved. Are we all agreed? Agreed. The final motion is motion S5M-21028 that the Justice Committee recommends that the First Tier Tribunal for Scotland General Regulatory Chamber Parking and Bus Lane Appeals Rules of Procedure Regulations 2020 draft be approved. Minister to move.
Moved.
Do members have any questions or comments? The question is that motion 21028 in the name of Ashdenham be approved. Are we all agreed? We are all agreed. That concludes consideration of the affirmative instruments. Is committee agreed to delegate authority to me as convener to clear the final draft of the report on the affirmative instruments we have considered today? Agreed. Then only remains for me to thank the Minister and her officials for attending and suspend briefly to allow them to leave. Item 6 is consideration of a UK Government bill and the issue of legislative consent. I refer members to paper 3, which is note by the clerk. Do members have any comments or questions? No. Our members agreed that the Scottish Parliament should give its consent to the relevant provisions in the Air Traffic Management and Unmanned Aircraft Bill. Agreed. Thank you. Agenda item 7 is consideration of petition 1458, which is a proposal to establish a register of judicial interests. I refer members to paper 4, which is note by the clerk. Do members have any comments or questions? John Finney.
Thank you, Convener. Yeah, I thought it was very interesting contributions we had there from the Cabinet Secretary and from the various judicial people, and indeed, finally, comment on each of these from the petitioner. The debate seems to be pretty polarised, and I understand it's a considerable number of years that the petition's been open, and I'm very keen. I think there is an issue here that remains undealt with. I think the public would anticipate that there is some measure of accountability there. I note the comments that are said about intrusion into the independence of the judiciary, and I wonder if there's an opportunity perhaps to investigate that further as a way of going forward. I'm conscious that this has been around a long time. I mean, I'm supportive of the principle. I note everything that's been said, but we seem to have hit a bit of an impasse, and I would be keen to hear the views of people like constitutional lawyers.
Yes, Liam MacArthur.
Thank you, Convener. I very much agree with John Finney. I think intuitively I find myself supportive of the idea of a register, but I don't underestimate some of the concerns that have been raised by the Cabinet Secretary and representatives of the judiciary, particularly around the independence of the judiciary and all this. The debate is rather polarised. It's difficult to see where compromise might be possible here, but I just wonder whether or not we might proactively elicit views from perhaps academics in this area, with a view to maybe testing some of the arguments that we made to us in the helpful evidence that we're looking at in this meeting.
Rona, then Alistair.
Thank you, Convener. Yeah, I mean, I think this is an issue. It's a very important issue, and it's one that I think will not just disappear. I think it's something that we as a committee should investigate a bit further, take some wider evidence so that to inform our views on it. And I'd be in favour of doing that at this stage, albeit it's, you know, we have, as John says, reached a bit of an impasse. I think it's incumbent on us to take a wider look at it for the time being.
Alistair, then James.
Yes, like the others have said, this is clearly an important issue, and one that probably merits us having a conversation or a discussion about in committee. I think on principle, the only thing I would add is that if the petition has been in the system for 8 years, I think we should take evidence with a view to bringing the matter to a conclusion. I don't think it's fair to have petitions in the committee for that length of time without bringing them to some kind of conclusion, but I would be happy enough to hear evidence on it.
Rona? Sorry, Rona's been James.
Thank you, Convener. I've become convinced of the case for a register of interest in relation to the judiciary over the period that the committee have been examining this issue. Note the responses from the Cabinet Secretary and Lord Carloway. Clearly we've got a bit of a standoff here, and I think the suggestions that members have made to try and take additional evidence to take it forward is sensible. I don't think we should park the issue. I think this is an important issue, and we should continue to press on it.
Okay. Are there any other views from members of the committee? I should just say that I think there's one petition that we've been dealing with at least that has been even in excess of 8 years, and that's the McGrackie case petition. But as you say, not ideal. So would it be fair to say then that given the impasse, diametrically opposed views, and in an effort to move forward, then the committee would seek further information and a non-record in session with perhaps constitutional lawyers and others, with a view to looking at the pros and cons of the petition, and will then take a formal decision, and also ask maybe Spice and the clerks for a note of these wider issues, perhaps even taking into account just any other conflict of interest issues which might have a bearing on how court decisions are taken. Liam?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think the format of that evidence session would maybe better be carried out through a round table rather than a more traditional evidence session. And I think in the information provided by Spice, due to the fact that it was referred to by the Cabinet Secretary and previously by the petitioner, the situation in New Zealand appears to have taken a different course. It would certainly be useful to have an understanding as to the kind of thought process they've gone through to arrive at the decision they have in relation to this same issue.
Okay. Are we all agreed then? That's the way forward? Thank you. Right, that concludes the public part of today's meeting. Our next meeting will be Tuesday, 17th of March, when we'll begin consideration of the Defamation and Malicious Publications Scotland Bill. And we now move into private session.